This workshop is inclusive reading approaches. Building on the keynote, again, my interest is this time on reading. We'll look at reciprocal teaching in particular, a reading technique, but I'm still focusing on how we can get our learners to feel good about themselves, to feel successful, and to develop strategies that actually work for them. So I'm going to address the question, what do I do, what can I do if my learners struggle to read and or make sense of my materials? The stereotypical dyslexic pattern is to struggle with aspects of the decoding, but usually comprehend better than they decode. This is the linear opposite, I suppose, of youngsters of whom English is a second language, who often read the words quite well, but then struggle to work out what they mean. So this is the colleague again who sidles up to in the coffee queue and says, "Your kids can't read my materials." So, okay, well, have you tried? Have you done? Okay, that's where we're going to go with this. The ultimate word here is that we do have to get the phonics right. There is a school of thought internationally in Australia and other places who are down on phonics. They say phonics is boring, it doesn't work, and so on. But let's be, we need to think about meaning. But let's be absolutely clear, you cannot work out meaning unless you can read the words. So phonics is essential. Roughly 60% of youngsters will learn to read despite us, whatever method we use. The other 40% will only learn to read if we use synthetic phonic approaches to get them going. So, and David Kilpatrick is an Australian researcher, well worth a read. Everything he says makes sense. But there may be times for less decoding and more context as you get older. By older, I mean probably 9, 10, 11, 12 plus. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing phonics. I made the point earlier, I believe. We stopped teaching phonics far too soon. I've been an enthusiastic teacher of higher level phonics in primary and secondary, into morphographs and so on and so on. And it is such a good thing to do. But now we're going to say, in this particular reading thing, let's look at context, the power of context. Context really matters. It really does. And I hope this slide explains it, because if we don't have context and we're only looking at one tiny bit of it, how on earth are we going to make sense of it? Especially if we're struggling to decode all the words. If we don't have the big picture before we start, we are going to struggle. Why? Well, there is a really good reason. And that reason is that context is king. There is no other phrase I can use. Context is king. Making use of context then is where we need to be. And context works roughly around 3 areas. We've got grammar, we've got semantics, which is meaning, and knowledge of the world. So semantics, yeah, that fits. Yes, that works. Knowledge of the world is pragmatics. That makes sense to me. And grammar, of course, is it sounds right. And these are 3 of the things we use to make context work for us. Sometimes we only use one of them, sometimes we use all 3. So when we're confronted by a word or a phrase that doesn't make sense, if we follow the rule, if in doubt, leave it out and read on, ultimately, usually, one of these 3 will trigger. Either the grammar or the semantics or the pragmatics will kick in, but only if we have context. Without context, it doesn't work. So the quickest fix really for resolving comprehension issues, regardless of the reading competence of the learner, is prior knowledge. And the bottom line is, the more learners know about a subject, the easier it is for them to do the reading, because the more they know about it, the more semantics, pragmatics, and so on they can bring when they hit a word or a phrase that doesn't make sense. They can use their big picture understanding, which is very much a dyslexic strength. So what we're going to do, and I'll model some techniques for this, is how we can tap into prior knowledge getting learners to think about, share with a neighbor, the sort of pair share things I talked about in the keynote, what they know about a topic before they read it. I'm strongly a disbeliever in reading a passage myself and then letting the class read it. Never worked for me, but giving them lots of clues before I read it, they read it, has worked. Reminders about what they've done recently, maybe a practical exercise, share with a neighbor. All this stuff before we read it is going to be very powerful. Our seminal study really made the point. I've been sharing this now with groups for about a year or so, and primary, secondary, and in further education as well. And every group I've ever done this with is going, wow, yeah, you know what? We need to think about this in our work. So let's look at baseball and comprehension. Research from 1988, Recht and Leslie. Group of good readers, poor readers, all about memory of text. So the students heard the same story. They read the story, they had a model, and there was a quiz. So that was basically what happened. There were 4 groups within the research. One group were good readers, and they knew a lot about baseball. One group were good readers, knew little about baseball. One group didn't read very well, but knew loads. And one group didn't read very well and didn't know much. So there's our 4 groups. And the prediction exercise, and this is one that if you're doing training with your colleagues, is well worth asking them. You know, I would say, what's the order of success? It's pretty obvious who's going to get most of them right, but who's going to come second, who's going to come third, and so on. Okay. When we look at this graph, there may be some surprises. So in fact, I will just shut up for a minute while you have a look and see if you anticipated that. I guess no surprises that the high reading ability and high knowledge group came up top, but look who came second. It wasn't the other high reading group. It was the low reading group who knew lots about baseball. Their prior knowledge significantly compensated for lack of reading ability. They are within a few points of the high reading ability, high knowledge. And they are much, much better than the guys who read well but don't know much about baseball. Interestingly, then, what we realized then is that background knowledge significantly compensates for reading issues. And this research has been replicated, and we reckon it's valid. So the results say, you know, prior knowledge, yes. Weaker readers can do nearly as well if they've been introduced to the key elements before they've been asked to read a passage. So how about perhaps a policy within a school? Before we ask learners to read a passage, we really do set the context. We might say, last week we were doing whatever. You might discuss the purpose. You might share some of the key points, look out for, pay real attention. You're really getting them into the contextual ballpark before they start to read. It also pays to point out and unpack some of the jargon words and phrases they're going to encounter. Can you remind your neighbor what these words and phrases mean? If this is problematic, it's a good heads up for us, because if we do have a problem with it, we may need to revisit the language. This is where we have to sort of, in a sense, junk the lesson for some youngsters, so we can unpack the language to get it sorted out. So checking for understanding, work with a neighbor, things like summarize this passage in 1 sentence, 3 bullet points. You can do a 3-3-1, which I mentioned in the keynote. 3 questions for a quiz, using the words might or could to keep it higher level. All these things are, they're getting youngsters into the context, and they're also triggering retrieval, because they will have knowledge, but what they need to do is to be able to access it. So the retrieval process is also beginning to work. So my takeaway from this first bit is that all learners, forget youngsters with dyslexia, will read more effectively and they'll understand more if we can launch from a platform of prior knowledge. They need to be reminded about what they know, what they've done, and this then brings the retrieval process into play, and it allows you to harness the baseball study to ensure that weak basic skills are not a barrier to ability appropriate understanding. Your colleagues, I'll be disappointed if your colleagues do not find this a really good solution to this particular problem. Another context setting approach is what I call tcpqr. It's something I developed a long time ago. If you ask youngsters, what's the first thing you do when you get a comprehension passage? Many of them say read it through all the way before you start, and that's the worst thing you could possibly do. Sometimes they say read the questions first, which is a bit better, but actually no, I would say no. Follow my mnemonic. The first thing you think about is the title. Now, 50% of your class will not read the title first, and they're called boys. We tend to dive straight in. But the title is brilliant for setting the context, prior knowledge, and so on. So doing oracy on the title is really great. Where does it fit in? What do we know already? We then validate or modify our view by looking at captions and pictures. Anything in bold, anything in a box, data table, all of this will give us contextual clues and will either tell us that our view of the title is correct or we need to modify it. Having done all this, we have enough background knowledge, prior knowledge, to look at the questions. The reason we leave the questions until now is that there may be some words or phrases which are problematic, but because we are now in the contextual ballpark, I reckon we can deal with them. And the questions often give new information, and questions often give answers. The answer to question 2 is often found in question 5 or 6 or 7. So it's well worth reading all the questions through. It also tells you what you're looking for. So when you come to read it as the final stage, you're reading it in a different way. You've never read it this way before. You know exactly what you're looking for, why you're reading it, and you're now trying to actually validate your predictions as much as anything else. So this is powerful. So I'll model a chunk of this. I haven't got the time to do it all, but I'll model a chunk of this. So I'm going to give you, this is what I do when I'm doing training, this title, Torrey Canyon. Now, if you're my age group, you will know all about Torrey Canyon. If you're a bit younger, you might not, but it doesn't matter. So we would say to the class, what's it about? And they'll say, well, you know what? I think it's about a canyon called Torrey. That is a great answer. It's completely wrong, but with the evidence at hand at the moment, I'll accept it. So that's the title. A canyon called Torrey. Yeah, okay. Do anything about it? No, nothing whatsoever. Doesn't matter. So now let's do captions and pictures. Okay. So what I've done is I've blocked out the text. This is to stop speedy readers whizzing through and pulling answers out. So there we are. Torrey Canyon seabed returns to normal after oil spill. They say, the canyon called Torrey is under the water. And there's been an oil spill, but it's okay. There's been a wildlife disaster. That's a dead seabird. Using the wrong charts. I think, that doesn't fit, does it? So we say, okay, well, remember it, but just hold on to that one. The Royal Navy steps in. Good. 1967, big cleanup. Bioremediation gives hope. So they're now thinking, you know what, this is about an environmental disaster of some sort, and that's triggering all sorts of prior knowledge, all sorts of stuff they've seen on the TV and whatever. So they're pretty sure whatever they're reading about is to do with an environmental disaster. There's been a cleanup and there is hope for the future. Okay, good. And then we have the prize, if there is one, which is a data table. Always look for a data table because it gives you so much information. And we find out there was a cargo of crude oil. And now that we think, hang on a minute, using the wrong charts, cargo, ship, yes. Big oil slick, lots of stuff on the beaches, the Royal Navy dropped bombs on it and so on. We are so in the ballpark. So now we ask the question, when did the Torrey Canyon run aground? And we can look at our pictures, we can find the answer. What was the ship carrying? Oh, I'll tell you what, if they can't answer this one, I'm probably going to break down and sob. How did the Royal Navy help? Well, they dropped bombs on it, and so on and so on. You can answer 2 or 3 questions just from the data table alone, because you're in the contextual ballpark. This really, it's a great non-fiction tcpqr, great non-fiction tool for getting into context. If there are no captions or pictures, as there might be, then what we do this time is we go for the title as before. And what we do is we pick up the opening and closing sentences of each paragraph and think, what do I know already? So a title, global warming. Imagine the year is somewhere in the future. Scary, right? What's it about? Well, you know, we can make pretty informed guesses. And if we do that for all the paragraphs, once again, we're in the contextual big picture, and we come across words and phrases that are problematic, we can use context to get us through. And metacognition comes in beautifully here. Self-talk is worth up to 20 months progress in 12. So going through this, you know, I'm thinking, I'm wondering, I'm noticing, it reminds me of. Now this takes practice. It doesn't just happen immediately, but it's worth working through. So if I give you a picture like this, I can see, I think, I wonder. If then the text, the upcoming text is going to be so much easier to deal with because you're in the contextual ballpark. So going back to the baseball study, you may not be the best reader in the world, but if I have set you up with your metacognitive, I think, I wonder, I see techniques, then this is really going to compensate for whatever basic skill issues you have, and it will allow you to bring your knowledge, and in many cases your intelligence, to the question and come up with some cracking good answers. A word to the wise, it is well worth now and again reading the questions out loud just to make sure that the barrier is to comprehension is not just the reading process. So reading them out loud is good. Getting a peer to scribe answers is also good. You compare the quality of the scribed answer to the quality of the written answer. Once again, we may well find out that the barrier is simply basic skills. It's not comprehension at all. I've never understood, as a teacher, why it is in schools that have ability tables, particularly, or even sets, that you've got youngsters in high sets who read beautifully, but don't really understand, and youngsters in low sets who don't read very well, but do understand. It seems to me to be absolutely crazy. But there we go. I'll move on from that. Another process, very strongly recommended in the research, which gives up to 9 months extra progress, 21 months progress in 12, is reciprocal teaching or reciprocal reading. This has come to us from New Zealand, where it's very popular, very successfully used, and it is being used in pockets all around the country. I had the privilege of working in Aberdeenshire a few years ago, where I was driving around primary schools, modeling this technique. I would dive into a school, do this with a couple of classes, move on to the next school, and so on. It was a joy to do, and it was also fascinating to watch how well the dyslexic youngsters did, and also to see how surprised some of the teachers were at how well some of the dyslexic youngsters comprehended. I don't think they ever realized how good their comprehension skills were. So reciprocal teaching is a group-based thing, mixed ability group, where a group of 4 or 5, where everybody has a role. Groups below 5, you can double up the roles. Yeah. So you have a predictor, a reader, a clarifier, a question, and a summarizer. Now that's the traditional way of doing this. I don't do it quite this way. I do it slightly differently. I put the predictor in charge of getting predictions from the group. So the predictor, you're the boss. You don't predict, you get the group to predict. The reader, you don't read, you get the group to read it for you, and so on and so on and so on. And a word to the wise, get the weak reader to be in charge of reading. And then the weak reader doesn't have to do the reading, but it gets the work read to them. Short passages rather than big passages. You don't want, if it gets too long, it becomes a real pain, but you can work that out for yourself. So the reader gets the work read to them. The clarifier says, can you help me with words and phrases that might need to be unpacked for a younger child? The questioner wants questions that will confirm understanding, and the summarizer gets a summary. Why bother? Well, the research evidence is quite compelling. That top one there, struggling readers growing 1 to 2 years in 3 to 6 months. Well, I'll take that any day. Significant changes between pre and post. Hattie, one of the most powerful instructional practices. And that's because it's a combination of strategy, metacognition, and direct instruction as well. So yeah, it is good stuff. The cards I've got here, the predicting, the reading, the clarifying, the questioning, slide 33, slide 34, summarizing. These 3 sets of slides you can pick up from TES resources if you want to use it this way. This is not the way I do it, but they're there for you if you want to use them. I'll explain my way now. This was a piece I was using in Aberdeenshire. So what we'll do is we'll give each table a title, an opening sentence, and a closing sentence, and say to the group, what's the middle about, guys? What's it about? Okay, we've read this to them and we've let them loose. Once they've done their predicting, we'll do the reading. It's not the best picture in the world, but this was the piece we were using. So we will now give out 1 between 2, my advice is, 1 between 2. And the student in charge of reading would say, okay, Susie, can you read the first 2 sentences? Neil, the next 2. Paul, can you read the first 2 sentences in the box? And Jenny, can you read the last 2, please? Okay, so we read it, and we're reading it to see if our predictions are correct. This is earthquakes. We were doing this again in Aberdeenshire with older youngsters. What we found here, what I found here, was that they needed more than a title, an opening and closing sentence to make it work. So what I did was I gave them earthquakes, the Earth's crust, and the first sentence. I also gave them seismograph and a sentence, as well as the closing sentence on interesting facts. What I found was that there was too much information in it for them to get the full gist with just the beginning, the middle, and the end. So use your judgment. It's not hard and fast. But what I would say is that much more reading than that is going to be too much. So I do this slightly differently, as I said. My predictor is in charge of getting predictions from the group. My reader, we've mentioned. My clarifier is in charge of getting the group to identify tricky words and phrases. My questioner is in charge of getting the group to come up with questions, which fits in beautifully with other things I've been talking about. The summarizer is in charge of getting the group to shrink the passage. So a predictor would say, okay, guys, from the information we have, what might this passage be about? The reader gets the group to read bits of it to validate or modify their prediction. The clarifier says, okay, well, are there any words and phrases we might need to explain to younger people? Younger people works well, they quite like that. Questioner, well, what questions do we need to ask to make sure there's understanding? Summarizer, well, okay, could we summarize in 1 question? I'll give you some ideas for that in a minute. So those are the roles. And you orchestrate, okay, as the teacher, you're orchestrating. People say, shouldn't we teach the roles first? Possibly. But as I said, whizzing around the schools in Aberdeen, it wasn't necessary. I just told them what to do, you know what? And they did it beautifully. And it'll be your dyslexics who are often super good at the questioning and the summarizing. So let me model this as I would do in training with adults now. We're going to look at global warming, and we're going to use reciprocal teaching as our method. So if I was doing this with you as a group in a training session, I would give you the title, the topic sentence, and the closing sentence. You would do oracy on what you think it's about, you'd argue about it, and most people come up with a sort of dystopian Mad Max view of the future. Once then, I will remind you of what your roles are. Everybody's bagged a role by now. If you need to double the roles up, that's quite okay. You can be a clarifier and summarize. You can be a question and predictor. It's up to you. It really isn't that important. What is important is that each role is ultimately represented. So here's the passage now, and the reader will allocate bits of it, so everybody's reading it. And the idea, we're reading it out loud for each other to validate our view of the title. We think it's about a very unhappy future. And when you read it, you realize that is the case. So we've read it now. Our predictions have been modified. And then we come to the clarifier. The clarifier's role is to lead the group to identify words and phrases that need unpacking. And you can see how we're really getting into the context now. So I would give the clarifier a highlight pen, and the clarifier can either read through the paragraph asking for suggesting words, or the group can throw them out. So dramatic upheaval, yeah. Abundance, yeah, definitely need to explain that. Carefully made, yes, we do that one. Particulate matter, no idea what that is. Desalination, yeah. So what we're doing, we're highlighting, and the clarifier is recording words and phrases that they might need to unpack. We're not unpacking them at this moment. All we're doing is identifying them. If you wish, it's well worth then putting some time into unpacking them, and I would do it online. I wouldn't mess about with thesauruses or stuff. It takes too long. Do it the way we would all do it, which is Google it, and quickly come up with what it is. Get it done the way we would do at home. So our clarifier has done this. And of course, we're now delving into the detail. We've gone big picture, and now we're homing in on the detail. What it means is that when ultimately we come to use this passage for whatever the purpose is, everybody is into the context. So just a reminder then, we've predicted, we've read, we've clarified, and now we question. And the questioner says, okay, guys, what questions do we need to ask to make sure people understand this passage? And I'm a believer in using question stems. If you go into Google Images, there are thousands of question stems. But we're not, in this context, we're not going to go for understanding, because understanding is just boring. Okay, that's just too easy. How many, what color? No, we don't want that. In fact, we're going to go for HOTS, higher order thinking skills, because lots, you know what, they're just boring. Okay, we're not doing boring stuff. We want reading to be really exciting. So what we're looking for are questions that use those words. Can you use the word? How would you compare? How might you critique? How could you produce? These are higher order questions. And one of the things I do when I do this is I might present my classes with this list here, this table. And the idea is you get 1 mark for remembering question and 6 for a creating question. And you say, right, how few questions can you come up with to earn 20 marks? So 3 creating and an understanding would work, 4 evaluating, and so on. So what we're asking them is to say, right, how could you critique this passage as if you were a climate change denier? How could you construct a building that would be proof against flooding? And so on, and so on, and so on. Now, this takes a bit of skill, it takes a bit of practice, takes a bit of modeling, but once they've got it, they are away. And the question stems serve the same purpose as sentence starters, paragraph starters, and so on that I was talking about in my writing workshop. Here are 200 plus Bloom words from Pinterest. Once again, too many to use in a lesson, but you can pull some of those out, and you can see that once we get into the higher order questions, words, there are some really good questions that can come out. How could you? How might you? How would somebody? Yeah, loads of good things. How could you justify continuing to dig coal given this passage, and so on and so on and so on. And all the time, because they're retrieving past experience, past knowledge, things they've read about, things they've heard about, things they've talked about, they're really integrating their knowledge. And so, as I keep saying, when they come across words, phrases that they struggle with, the big picture, the general big picture, helps them hugely with their comprehension. Then we come to the summarize, which I quite enjoy. The summarizer leads the team. I use a 3-line haiku quite often. That's great fun to do. Remember, haiku is a 5-syllable, 7-syllable, 5-syllable poem, which brings in a bit of phonics as well. So climate change is here. I'll clap this. Climate change is here. We then want a 7-syllable line, a 5-syllable line. The idea is that each line must stand alone. This is not an English thing. I've done it in history, done it in geography, done it in science, done it in psychology. One sentence summary works a treat with given rules. You might say exactly 12 words, exactly 17 words. Must begin with because for cause and effect. Only one comma, maximum of one comma. All these things are getting the big picture and getting the group to share their haiku, their sentence. It's a tweet, 140 characters. That works well too. Once again, if you're in secondary particularly, don't allow colleagues to think these are English techniques. These are generic literacy techniques, which are powerful in all subjects. So by the time we get to the summarizer, we've gone back to the big picture. We started with our generic big picture with the prediction. We've read it to validate. We've then begun to home in on the detail. And now we're back to the big picture again. So we're really harnessing context and big picture learning, which means that when we do let them loose on the passage, the topic, whatever it is, be pretty sure that everybody is up to speed. A real challenge with the haiku, just by the by, is how few words you can do it in. It has been done in 3. With a 5-syllable word, a 7-syllable word, and a 5-syllable word. Seriously tough. So the takeaway strategy is that context setting is critical, and it will seriously overcome reading problems for learners who think faster than they read. These are the ones who, in a comprehension test, reading comprehension test, will lose marks in the actual accuracy because they make mistakes. Their reading comprehension scores are always better than their reading accuracy. And for me, that is one of the things that sets my dyslexia antennae twitching. Anybody whose comprehension is better than their accuracy, I start to think, I need to deal with that. I noticed there's yet another spelling mistake in this one as well. Deliberate, of course. As a teacher, I only make mistakes to see whether you've noticed, and I'm sure you did. So context setting via tcpqr works a treat. Please model it several times. Please model it by blocking out the text and making people rely solely on the clues you want them to. Reciprocal reading is just fantastic. It works. Works a treat. It's better for non-fiction than fiction. You can use it for fiction, but you want to be very careful with the passage. You want a passage which hangs together and isn't too long. I've recently had some success with James and the Giant Peach, where the peach squashed the ant, I think it was. A nice passage, or George and his medicine as well. So where lots of things happen in a fairly short space of time, that works well. What these things do is they reduce the impact of weak decoding, and they empower our guys to make use of context, retrieve the prior knowledge, and use basically their common sense and intelligence. So this workshop, inclusive reading approaches, the intention is to have strategies to offer when colleagues say, my class, your kids can't understand, make sense, remember, make sense of my reading. And what I hope you feel is that the strategies I put together will address the issues. I've presented them because we'll put them in on behalf of our quick thinking, slower decoding dyslexic students in the certain knowledge that they actually work for everybody. Thank you for your time.